I had my first sleepover when I was 12, and it ended up being my last sleepover for a while. You're about to hear why. It was a dark and stormy night when my best friend Emma invited me over for a sleepover. I was thrilled, as it was my first time staying the night at a friend's house. We spent the evening playing games, watching movies, and gossiping about our classmates. As the night grew darker, so did our conversations. Emma told me about a girl who used to live in her house before her family moved in. Apparently, the girl had mysteriously disappeared one night, never to be seen again. The police had searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of her. Emma's family had bought the house at a surprisingly low price, and she was convinced it was because of the girl's disappearance. As we sat in her dimly lit room, Emma kept telling me about the strange occurrences that had been happening in the house. She claimed to hear footsteps in the hallway at night, even though no one was there. Sometimes she would wake up to find her toys rearranged or her clothes neatly folded when she hadn't done it herself. I tried to brush off her stories as mere imagination, but as the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The old house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, and the shadows seemed to dance on the walls, playing tricks on my mind. As we settled into our sleeping bags, Emma insisted on telling one last story. She told me about a ghostly figure that had been seen in the house, a girl with long dark hair and a blank expression. Emma said that the girl had been standing at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. That made me shiver, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a story. But as I lay there, trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tossed and turned, unable to find peace. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze on my face, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my sleeping bag, was a girl with long dark hair and a blank expression. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The girl reached out her hand towards me, and in that moment I knew that I had to get out of there. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, grabbed my things, and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my own home. I never told anyone what I saw that night, not even Emma. I didn't have another sleepover until nearly 3 years later. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day, and even now, I can't help but wonder what really happened to that old, creaky house. This one time in college, I spent the night at the house of one of my friends. We ended up doing a lot of classic sleepover things, like playing games, eating junk food, and watching movies, and it was honestly a good and nostalgic time. However, as the night deepened, the atmosphere in the room shifted from lighthearted to eerie. One of my friends, who had a penchant for the supernatural, suggested we play a game called the Sandman. I was hesitant at first, but the group's enthusiasm was infectious. The game involved one of us lying in the center of the room while the rest of us sat in a circle around them. The person in the middle was supposed to be the sleeper, and the rest of us were to tell a story about the Sandman coming to fill their body with sand, rendering them immobile. The story was told, and as the details grew more gruesome, I found myself getting sucked into the narrative. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering candle. The shadows danced on the walls, adding to the unsettling ambiance. As the story reached its climax, the person in the center was instructed to stand up. But, to our horror, they couldn't. They were frozen, their body rigid and unresponsive. Panic set in as we tried to shake them awake, but it was as if they were trapped in a nightmare. The atmosphere in the room became oppressive, the air thick with fear. We tried everything we could think of to break the spell, but nothing worked. It was as if the Sandman had truly come and taken our friend away. As the night wore on, we huddled together, trying to make some sense of what had happened. The room felt colder, and the shadows darker. The flickering candle cast eerie shadows on the walls, making it seem like there were more of us in the room than there actually were. It was only when the first light of dawn broke through the window that our friend finally stirred. They were disoriented, unable to remember the night's events. We never spoke of it again, but the memory of that night stayed with us, a chilling reminder of the power of fear and the unknown. I had my first sleepover in the 3rd grade. My best friend, Emily, invited me to stay the night at her house. I was excited because it was my first time sleeping over at someone else's place. Emily's parents were out of town, but her older brother, Jake, was there to watch over us. The night started off fun enough, with us watching movies and eating snacks. But as it wore on, things started to feel a little strange. Emily kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone to be there. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said it was nothing. After a while, we decided to go to bed. Emily's room was at the end of a long hallway, and as we walked down it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Emily's room was decorated with dolls, which I thought was a little creepy. She said they were her mother's, and she didn't have the heart to get rid of them. We climbed into bed, and Emily turned off the light. The room was pitch black, and I could hear my own heart beating in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft creaking noise coming from the hallway. Emily sat up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. We huddled together under the covers, listening as the creaking noise got louder and closer. Suddenly, the door to Emily's room creaked open, and a dark figure stepped inside. Emily screamed, and I felt my heart jump into my throat. The figure moved closer, and as it stepped into the moonlight, I saw that it was Jake. He was holding a knife, and his eyes were wild and unfocused. "I told you not to have any sleepovers," he growled. "Now you're going to pay." Emily and I screamed and tried to run, but Jake was too fast. He grabbed Emily by the arm and dragged her out of the room. I tried to follow, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen with fear. The last thing I remember was the sound of Emily's screams echoing down the hallway. After that, everything went black. Eventually I woke up in Emily's bed the next morning, with no memory of how I got there. I quickly noticed that Emily was right beside me. Apparently, the whole episode with Jake had been a dream. To this day, I still don't know why I dreamed that. Like, I wasn't even afraid of Jake, and he didn't even interact with us the rest of the night. Even though it's not real, I'll never forget that experience, and how that sleepover turned into a literal nightmare. For my 13th birthday, my dad let me have a sleepover with my friends from school. I was ecstatic. It was my first sleepover, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. My friends and I had planned everything, from the movies we would watch to the games we would play. The night of the sleepover, my friends arrived one by one. We ate pizza, played video games, and watched our favorite movies. It was a blast. As the night wore on, we decided to play a game of hide-and-seek in the dark. We turned off all the lights and scattered around the house. I was it first. I counted to 30 while my friends hid. When I finished counting, I opened my eyes and began searching. I found 2 of my friends quickly, but the third, Emily, was nowhere to be found. I searched every room, every closet, every nook and cranny, but I couldn't find her. This is where I began to get worried. I called out to my dad, but he didn't answer. I searched the entire house again, this time with a flashlight. Still no sign of Emily. I started to panic. I decided to check the basement. It was dark and creepy down there, but I had to find Emily. I descended the stairs, and the flashlight barely illuminated the way. Eventually I reached the bottom and began searching. That's when I heard it, a faint whimpering sound. I followed it to a corner of the basement. There, huddled in a dark corner, was Emily. She was shaking and crying. I ran to her and hugged her. "What's wrong?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something down here," she whispered. I saw it when I was hiding. It was big and dark and it had glowing red eyes. It was watching me. I tried to calm her down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We made our way back upstairs, but the feeling of being watched never left us. The rest of the night was a blur. We tried to sleep, but none of us could. We were all too scared. The next morning, my dad found us huddled together in my room, wide awake. He asked what was wrong, but we couldn't tell him. How could we explain what we had seen, or at least what we had thought we had seen? To this day, I'm not sure what happened that night. Was it just our imaginations running wild? Or was there really something in the basement? I guess I'll never know for sure, but one thing is for certain. I'll never forget that sleepover. During the summers in middle school, I'd commonly hang out with my friend Jeff, and this was one of the nights I ended up sleeping over at his house. It was a warm summer night, and the cicadas were singing their song outside. Jeff's parents were out of town, so it was just the 2 of us. We had the whole house to ourselves. After a few hours of playing video games and watching movies, we decided to call it a night. Jeff led me to the guest bedroom, which was right next to his room. He said goodnight and went to his room, and then I closed the door and climbed into bed. As I lay there, trying to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from the closet. It sounded like something was scratching at the door. I tried to ignore it and go to sleep, but the scratching got louder and louder. I got out of bed and slowly made my way to the closet. I reached for the doorknob, but hesitated. The scratching had stopped. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The closet was empty. I let out a sigh of relief and was about to close the door when I heard a faint whisper. "Help me." I froze. The voice was coming from inside the closet. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence. I tried to call out to Jeff, but my voice was caught in my throat. The whisper grew louder. "Help me, please." I stumbled back and fell onto the bed. The room started to spin, and the walls seemed to close in on me. I felt like I was going to suffocate. Suddenly, the door to Jeff's room burst open. He was standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice trembling. I couldn't speak. I just pointed to the closet. Jeff slowly made his way to the closet and opened the door. There was nothing there. We both stood there, staring into the empty closet. The room was silent, and then we heard it. It was a scratching sound, coming from inside the closet again. That was it. Jeff slammed the door shut and we both ran out of the room. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too scared to go back to the bedroom. We never found out what was in the closet that night, but we both knew that it wasn't just our imagination. There was something there, something that wanted to hurt us, and we were lucky to have escaped with our lives. One night my best friend Tony was sleeping over, and my little brother, who thought he was one of the coolest guys ever, kept trying to impress him with random stories he'd made up. Meanwhile, our mom was cooking some of our favorite food. Tony and I were in my room, trying to decide what movie to watch, when my little brother burst in, eyes wide with excitement. "Guys, I have to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and thrill. "Last night, I saw something in the backyard. It was a shadow, but it wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen. It was moving on its own, like it was alive." Tony and I exchanged a skeptical look, but my brother continued, undeterred. "I swear, it was the strangest thing. It moved like it was trying to hide, but it was so big I couldn't miss it." Our mom called us down for dinner, and as we ate, my brother kept up his story. "I think it might be a ghost," he whispered, his eyes darting around the room as if the shadow might appear at any moment. "It's probably looking for something it lost, or maybe something it wants to haunt." Tony seemed to be enjoying the story, asking my brother for more details, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off somehow. I remember the old tree in our backyard, its branches casting eerie shadows on the ground when the moon was full. It had to be that, I thought, trying to convince myself. After dinner, Tony and I went back to my room, but my brother's story had left us both on edge. We decided to watch a comedy instead of a horror movie, hoping it would lighten the mood. But as the night went on, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow my brother had seen. When it was time for bed, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling. That's when I heard a faint creaking, like the sound of a door opening, and then footsteps. My heart raced as I realized the footsteps were coming from the hallway outside my room. I sat up, clutching my blanket, and saw a dark figure at the foot of my bed. It must have been the shadow my brother had described, but it was no tree branch. It was something else entirely. The shadow moved closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. I screamed, and the shadow disappeared. Tony woke up, startled, and asked what was wrong. I told him what I'd seen, and he didn't believe me at first. But then we heard the footsteps again, and this time they were coming from my brother's room. We rushed to my brother's room and found him sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with fear. "It's here," he whispered. "The shadow is here." Tony and I looked at each other, and then we heard it again. The creaking of the door, the footsteps. We ran to my mom's room and woke her up, telling her everything. She didn't believe us at first, but then she heard the footsteps too. We searched the house, but found nothing. The shadow had vanished, just like it had appeared. But none of us could shake the feeling that it was still there, watching us, waiting. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the house. We never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the creaking of the door, the footsteps. And I wonder if the shadow is still there, waiting for its next victim. This one time our class was doing this arts and crafts project, and I and one of my friends Justin were working on it together. He ended up coming over to my house after school so we could keep working on it, and it slowly turned into a sleepover. The project was due the next day, and we had spent hours cutting, gluing, and painting. Our hands were stained with colors, and our clothes were splattered with paint. But it was fun, and the project was turning out great. As the night wore on, we decided to take a break and watch a movie. The movie was a horror flick, one of those old ones that are more cheesy than scary. But as the night grew darker, the shadows in my room started to deepen, and the creaking of the old house grew louder. I started to feel uneasy, and I could tell Justin was feeling it too. After the movie, we decided to go to bed. Justin said he was too scared to sleep alone, so I offered to let him sleep in my room. We set up a makeshift bed on the floor and settled in. But as soon as the lights went out, the noises started. It started with a soft scratching at the window. Then a low moan seemed to come from the hallway. Justin and I huddled together, our hearts pounding in our chests. The scratching grew louder, and the moan turned into a wail. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just the old house settling, but as the night wore on, the noises grew more persistent and more insistent. I could feel Justin trembling next to me, and I knew he was as scared as I was. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, the noises finally stopped. We waited until the sun was fully up before we dared to move. When we finally got up, we were both shaken, but relieved that the night was over. We never talked about that night again, but I never forgot it, and to this day, I still wonder what was out there, scratching at the window, moaning in the hallway. But I know that some things are better left unknown. I had just put together my new gaming rig with an RTX 4090, and my friends were coming so we could all stay up late testing it out. The anticipation was high, the graphics card was top-notch, and the games we had lined up were going to look incredible. Eventually the doorbell rang and I let my friends in. We were all excited, chatting about the latest games we wanted to try out on the new rig. After setting up, we dove right in, starting with a horror game that promised to be terrifying. The graphics were indeed stunning, and the game's eerie atmosphere was heightened by the powerful GPU. As the night progressed, the games got creepier. The story revolved around a haunted house that was rumored to be cursed. Our characters were paranormal investigators, and we were tasked with uncovering the mystery behind the hauntings. The game was immersive, and soon, we were all on edge. Then something strange happened. The game glitched, and suddenly, the haunted house in the game looked exactly like my own house. It was uncanny, and we all paused the game, looking at each other nervously. "It's just a coincidence," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's keep playing." We continued, but the game started to mimic our real-life movements. When we walked down a hallway in the game, the same hallway in my house creaked. When we opened a door in the game, the same door in my house slammed shut. We decided to take a break and stepped out of the room. The house was silent, but it felt like it was watching us. "Maybe we should call it a night," one of my friends suggested. We all agreed, but as we were packing up, the lights flickered, and the game started playing by itself. The characters in the game were now running, screaming, and trying to escape the house. The same house that looked exactly like mine. We tried to shut it down, but the computer wouldn't respond. The game was taking over, and it felt like it was pulling us in. Then, the screen went black, and the game's main menu appeared. But it wasn't just the game, it was my house, too. We were trapped inside the game. We tried everything to escape, but nothing worked. The game had taken control, and it was playing us. We were the characters now, and our only goal was to survive the night in the haunted house. As the night wore on, the game's horror became real. The house was alive, and it was coming for us. We ran, we hid, we fought, but in the end, it was all in vain. When the sun rose, the game finally let us go. We were back in my room, the computer off, the game uninstalled. But the fear remained. We had survived the night, but at what cost? We were all shaken, and the memory of that night would haunt us forever. There was a slightly odd kid in my class named Norman, and for reasons I'm still not sure about, my mom decided to invite him over so we could have a sleepover one time. I was a little apprehensive about it, but I figured it couldn't hurt to try and make a new friend. The night of the sleepover, Norman arrived at my house with a big backpack and a strange look in his eyes. I tried to make small talk, but he seemed more interested in staring out the window and muttering to himself. I shrugged it off and decided to just go with the flow. As the night wore on, things started to get weird. Norman kept insisting that we play a game he called The Dark Ritual. I didn't really want to, but he was so insistent that I eventually gave in. He told me to turn off all the lights and light a single candle in the middle of the room. Then he started chanting something in a language I didn't understand. Suddenly, the room got cold and the candle started flickering. I could feel a strange presence in the room, and I started to get really scared. Norman just kept chanting, his voice getting louder and more urgent. I tried to make him stop, but he just ignored me. Then, out of nowhere, the candle blew out and the room was plunged into darkness. I could hear Norman's laughter echoing through the room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, but when I looked around, Norman was nowhere to be found. I was alone in the room, but I could still feel that strange presence. I ran to my mom's room and told her what had happened, but when she came back to the room with me, everything was normal. The candle was back in its holder, and there was no sign of Norman. I never saw Norman again after that night, and I never found out what happened to him. But I'll never forget the fear I felt during that sleepover, and the strange feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. You ever have a science-themed birthday party, followed by a sleepover? I did, and it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. The day started innocently enough, with my friends and I doing fun experiments and making colorful slime. But as the night fell and the shadows grew longer, an eerie sense of unease settled over the room. The first strange thing I noticed was the flickering of the lights. At first I thought it was just the old wiring in my house, but the frequency and intensity of the flickering increased as the night wore on. It was as if the house itself was trying to warn us of something. Then the noises started. Soft whispers at first, barely audible over the sound of our laughter. But as the night grew darker, the whispers grew louder, until they were almost screams. We tried to ignore them, to convince ourselves that it was just the wind, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. As the clock struck midnight, the power went out completely. The darkness was absolute, and the only sounds were our frightened breaths and the pounding of our hearts. That's when we heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer with each passing second. We huddled together in the middle of the room, too scared to move or even breathe. The footsteps grew louder, until they were right outside the door. And then, silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was tall, impossibly so, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. It didn't say a word, but its presence was enough to make us scream in terror. The figure moved closer, and as it did, the room grew colder. Frost formed on the windows, and our breath came out in puffs of white. We tried to run, but our feet were frozen to the ground. The figure reached out, its hand like ice, and touched my forehead. I felt a surge of cold, like I was being sucked into a void. And then everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining and my friends were all there, looking as confused as I felt. The power was back on, and there was no sign of the figure or the footsteps. But I knew what I had seen, and what I had felt. And I knew that I would never forget that night. Back in high school, me and my friend Stan were really into liminal spaces, and one time we even had a liminal space-themed sleepover of sorts. It was late fall, and the leaves had just started to turn, painting the town in a palette of oranges and reds. Stan's parents were out of town for the weekend, so we had the house to ourselves. We spent the afternoon setting up our sleepover. Stan had a collection of old VHS tapes that he'd found in his attic, full of movies with strange, surreal plots that took place in liminal spaces. We planned to watch them all night. As the sun set, we lit candles around the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was literally perfect, just the right amount of eerie. We settled down on the couch, wrapped in blankets, and popped in the first tape. The movie was about a group of friends who got lost in a seemingly endless hotel, with hallways that stretched on forever and doors that led to nowhere. The more we watched, the more unsettled I felt. There was something off about the movie, something that made my skin crawl. After the movie ended, we decided to explore Stan's house. It was an old house, with creaky floorboards and dark corners. We wandered through the empty rooms, feeling like intruders in our own home. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old books. As we walked down the hallway, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. I blinked and it was gone. Stan laughed nervously, saying it was just my imagination. We went back to the living room and started another movie. This one was about a girl who woke up in a hotel with no memory of how she got there. The more we watched, the more I felt like I was being watched myself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Stan must have felt it too, because he suggested we go to bed. We turned off the TV and blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. I climbed into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. I could hear Stan tossing and turning next to me as well. At some point I must have dozed off though, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake. Stan was standing over me, his face pale in the moonlight. He said he'd heard a noise, like something walking around upstairs. We grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The upstairs hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We checked every room, but found nothing. As we turned to go back downstairs, I heard a soft whisper. I spun around, but there was no one there. We went back to the living room and huddled together on the couch, too scared to go back to sleep. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and paranoia. When the sun finally rose, we packed up our things and left, both of us shaken by the strange events of the night. To this day, I can't explain what happened at Stan's house. Maybe it was just our imaginations, fueled by the creepy movies we watched. Or maybe there really was something else there with us, something that didn't want us to leave. All I know is that I'll never forget that liminal space-themed sleepover, and the feeling of being watched in the dark. You know how sometimes when you're a kid, things don't really make sense, but you don't question them in the moment? Well, that was my experience during one of my sleepovers when I was 10. It was a chilly autumn night, and my best friend Sarah had invited me over for a sleepover. The plan was simple enough: watch scary movies, eat junk food, and stay up all night chatting about school and boys. As soon as I arrived at Sarah's house, I noticed something was off. Her usually bright and cheerful demeanor was replaced with a nervous, almost fearful expression. She didn't say much as she led me to her bedroom, which was unusually dark and quiet. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, but her voice was shaky. "Let's just start the movie." We settled on the floor with our sleeping bags and snacks, and Sarah put on a horror movie about a haunted house. I was a bit scared, but I didn't want to show it. Sarah seemed really into the movie, her eyes wide and her body tense. As the movie progressed, I started to feel uneasy. The room was getting colder, and I could have sworn I heard strange noises coming from the hallway. Sarah didn't seem to notice, her gaze fixed on the screen. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the movie getting to me, but when Sarah suddenly turned to me with a serious expression, I knew something was really wrong. You know how sometimes, when you're a kid, things don't really make sense but you don't question them in the moment? She whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "I think there's something in this house," she said, her eyes darting around the room. "I've been hearing things, seeing shadows moving. I didn't want to scare you, but I think we should leave." That last sentence hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to believe Sarah was just trying to scare me, but the fear in her eyes was real. I could also feel my own fear rising, the cold creeping up my spine. We decided to leave the room and explore the rest of the house, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange occurrences. But as we walked down the hallway, the temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing on the walls. We ran back to Sarah's room, door slamming shut behind us. The room was even colder now, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "I think we should call my parents," I said, my voice shaking. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. I dialed my parents' number, my hands trembling, but just as I was about to press the call button, the phone went dead. The room was suddenly filled with a deafening silence, broken only by the sound of our rapid breathing. We huddled together, too scared to move. And then we heard it. A low, raspy voice whispering our names, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. "Sarah, Emma, come to us." We screamed, our voices echoing through the house. The shadows seemed to converge, forming a dark, menacing figure that reached out towards us. We ran, our feet pounding on the floor as we raced down the stairs and out the front door. We didn't stop until we were far away from the house, gasping for breath in the cool night air. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Sarah and I never talked about it again, and I never went back to her house. But I'll never forget the fear, the feeling of being watched, and the chilling voice calling our names in the darkness. While my mom didn't like me having sleepovers as a kid, my stepdad was all for it. He said it was good for me to socialize and have fun with friends. So when my best friend Sarah asked if I could stay over at her house, I was thrilled when my mom reluctantly agreed. It was a chilly autumn night when I arrived at Sarah's place. Her parents were out for the evening, leaving just the two of us to enjoy our sleepover. We spent the evening eating pizza, watching scary movies, and giggling about boys. It was the perfect night. However, as it wore on, I began to feel uneasy. Sarah's house was old, and it creaked and groaned in the wind. The shadows seemed to dance and move on their own. I tried to push my fears aside and focus on the fun we were having, but then things took a turn. Sarah began to act strange. She became withdrawn and quiet, her eyes darting around the room nervously. I asked her what was wrong, but she just shook her head and said she was fine. As the night grew darker, the noises in the house grew louder. I could have sworn I heard footsteps upstairs. Sarah's behavior became even more erratic, and she began to mumble to herself. I was terrified. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house, not even bothering to say goodbye to Sarah. I ran all the way home, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got home, I told my mom and stepdad what had happened. They were shocked and immediately called Sarah's parents. It turned out that Sarah had been going through some kind of personal issues I won't go into, and had been acting out. They were grateful that I had left when I did. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been in that house with us that night. Something dark and sinister, and I never had another sleepover at Sarah's house again. Back in middle school, one of our classmates, Josh, was part of an extremely wealthy family. I'm talking his parents owned multiple beach houses. I was lucky enough to be his friend, and a few times we had sleepovers at one of the beach houses in the summer. One particular night, a group of us were gathered in the spacious living room of the beach house. The windows were wide open, letting in the cool ocean breeze and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. We were telling ghost stories, trying to outdo each other with the creepiest tales we could remember. As the night wore on and the stories got more intense, I noticed Josh's expression change. He seemed uneasy, almost scared. When I asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before telling us about the legend of the beach house. According to the story, the house was built on the side of an old shipwreck. The captain of the ship had cursed the land before he died, vowing to haunt anyone who dared to live there. Josh's parents had dismissed the tale as nonsense, but Josh couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to it. We all laughed it off, thinking it was just another ghost story, but as the night deepened, strange things started happening. The lights flickered, and we heard footsteps upstairs when no one was there. A cold wind blew through the house, even though all the windows were closed. We tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. We huddled together in the living room, not daring to move. Then we heard a loud banging on the front door. Josh went to check, but there was no one there. When he turned around, he saw a ghostly figure standing behind him. It was the captain from the shipwreck, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. We screamed and ran upstairs, locking ourselves in one of the bedrooms. We could hear the captain's footsteps following us, his ghostly laughter echoing through the house. We huddled together on the bed, not daring to move. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and we heard the captain whisper, "You should have listened to the legend." Then there was silence. We stayed there until dawn, too scared to move. When we finally ventured downstairs, everything was back to normal. The house was quiet, and there was no sign of the ghostly captain. We never told anyone about that night, but I'll never forget the fear in Josh's eyes as he told us the legend of the beach house. And I'll never look at a sleepover the same way again. I used to go to school with this girl named Mandy, who seemed to have a lot of personal issues. She was quiet, kept to herself, and always had this haunted look in her eyes. One day, Mandy invited me to her house for a sleepover. I was hesitant at first, but curiosity got the better of me. The night of the sleepover arrived, and I made my way to Mandy's house. It was a small old house on the outskirts of town. The inside was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy with an eerie silence. Mandy greeted me at the door with a forced smile, and we made our way to her room. As we settled in for the night, Mandy began to tell me stories about her past. She spoke of a childhood friend who had mysteriously disappeared, and how she had been haunted by nightmares ever since. I listened, trying to comfort her, but something felt off. As the night wore on, the stories became darker and more twisted. Mandy's eyes seemed to glow with a strange light, and her voice took on a sinister tone. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Then the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could hear Mandy's breathing quicken. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come here." I screamed and scrambled to turn on my phone flashlight. When the light illuminated the room, Mandy was gone. In her place was a dark, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing red. I tried to run, but the door was locked. I was trapped. The figure advanced towards us, its presence filling me with dread. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, but then the power came back on, and the figure was gone. I was alone in the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I never saw Mandy again after that night. To this day, I'm not sure if it was all a dream, or if something truly sinister happened. But one thing is for certain, I'll never forget that sleepover, and the terror that came with it. Back in the 6th grade, I had a crush on this girl named Lauren. She was the new girl in school, with long blonde hair and a smile that made my heart race. When I found out that she was coming to my sleepover party, I was over the moon. It was the perfect opportunity to impress her. The night of the sleepover arrived, and my friends and I were all gathered in my basement. We played video games, ate junk food, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. Lauren seemed to be having a great time, and I felt a surge of confidence. I was determined to make this night unforgettable. As the night grew darker, we decided to play a game of hide-and-seek. My basement was the perfect setting for it, with its many hiding spots and dark corners. Lauren and I were the last two to be found, and we hid together in a small closet. I could feel her breath on my neck as we huddled together, and I was sure that this was the moment I had been waiting for. But then, something strange happened. Lauren's eyes glazed over, and her voice changed. It was like she was possessed by something else. She started talking in a low, raspy voice, telling me that she knew my deepest fears and secrets. I was terrified, but I couldn't move. Lauren's body started to convulse, and she collapsed to the ground. I tried to call for help, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Suddenly, Lauren's eyes snapped open, and she started crawling towards me on all fours, her movements unnatural and jerky. I stumbled out of the closet, screaming for my friends. They came running, but it was too late. Lauren was gone, replaced by something dark and malevolent. We huddled together, trembling with fear, as the thing that used to be Lauren prowled around us, taunting us with our deepest fears. We never saw Lauren again after that night. The police searched for her, but she had simply vanished. Some say that she was taken by a demon, while others believe that she was the demon herself. But I know the truth. I know that the girl I had a crush on was not who she seemed, and that something dark and evil lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike when you least expect it. I have this weird childhood memory of my parents taking me and two of my friends Jeff and Peter to a restaurant during one of our sleepovers. It was a quaint little diner with dim lighting and booths that seemed to swallow you whole. The kind of place that felt like it had been there since the dawn of time. We were seated in one of those booths, my parents at one end and Jeff, Peter, and I at the other. We were talking and laughing, enjoying our food, when I noticed something strange. There was a man sitting at the bar, alone. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and hat, like something out of an old black and white movie. But what really caught my attention was his face. It was wrong somehow, like it was a mask or something. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to my conversation with Jeff and Peter, but every time I looked up, the man was still there, staring at us. I started to feel uneasy. After we finished our meal, my parents paid the bill and we got up to leave. As we passed the bar, the man turned to look at us. His face was still wrong, in that same way, but now it seemed even more distorted. I swear I saw that his mouth moved, like he was trying to say something. But before I could hear what it was, we were out the door and into the cold night air. I never saw that man again, but I'll never forget the way he looked at us that night. It was like he knew something we didn't, something dark and terrible. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder what he was trying to tell us. Back in high school, my friends and I had a bit of an Elon Musk fan club, however strange that sounds. During one of our sleepovers, we even created Elon and Tesla-themed art. It was a fun way to bond over our shared admiration for his innovative spirit and the exciting possibilities he was opening up in the world of technology and space exploration. That night, we were gathered in my friend's basement, which had been transformed into a makeshift art studio. We had a variety of materials spread out across a large table: paints, brushes, markers, and a stack of blank canvases. The atmosphere was lively and creative, filled with laughter and the occasional debate about the latest SpaceX launch or Tesla model. As the night wore on, we each worked on our own Elon-inspired masterpieces. Some of us painted the iconic Tesla logo, while others sketched out futuristic cityscapes powered by renewable energy. I decided to create a portrait of Elon himself, capturing his intense gaze and the hint of a smile that often played on his lips. Hours passed, and the basement grew quiet as everyone focused on their artwork. The only sounds were the soft scratching of pencils and the occasional rustle of paper. I was just putting the finishing touches on my portrait when I heard a strange noise from the corner of the room. It sounded like a faint, mechanical whirring, almost like the hum of a computer fan. I glanced around, but none of my friends seemed to have noticed. They were all engrossed in their own projects, oblivious to the odd sound. I shrugged it off and returned to my painting, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. It was starting to make me uneasy. I looked up again, and this time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, a small silver robot was hovering in midair. Its body was sleek and angular, with glowing blue eyes that seemed to bore into me. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and it was definitely not part of our Elon Musk fan club collection. I tried to call out to my friends, but my voice caught in my throat. The robot's gaze was fixed on me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't move, but I also couldn't look away. Suddenly, the robot spoke in a voice that was both mechanical and eerily human. "You have been chosen," it said. "You will be the first to witness the future." And with that, the robot darted forward, closing the distance between us in a fraction of a second. I felt a sharp pain in my neck, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the basement floor, surrounded by my friends. They were all looking at me with concern, asking if I was okay. I tried to tell them about the robot, but they just laughed and told me I must have fallen asleep and had a strange dream. But I know what I saw, and I know it was no dream. The Elon Musk fan club sleepover had taken a dark turn, and now I was left with a chilling memory that I could never share with anyone else. Back when I was in school, there was this one really attractive girl named Sally. Basically all of my friends and me had a crush on her. One day Sally invited me to a sleepover at her house. I was ecstatic. This was my chance to get closer to her. Little did I know that it would turn into the most terrifying night of my life. For starters, Sally's house was old and creaky, with dark corners and mysterious sounds. As we settled in for the night, Sally told me a story about the house being haunted by the ghost of a girl who died there many years ago. At first I laughed it off, thinking it was just a spooky tale to set the mood, but as the night wore on, strange things started to happen. First the lights flickered on and off, even though the power was working fine. Then I heard whispers in the walls, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but when I looked over at Sally, I saw a look of pure terror on her face. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart racing. "I think she's here," Sally whispered. "The ghost. She's angry." Before I could respond, the door to the bedroom slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Sally grabbed my hand and pulled me towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an eerie cacophony. I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I turned around slowly, and there she was, the ghostly figure of a girl, her eyes black and soulless. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Now you'll never leave." The last thing I remember is the ghostly girl lunging towards us, her mouth twisted into a terrifying grin. When I woke up, I was alone in the room. Sally was gone. I stumbled out of the house, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. To this day, no one knows what happened to Sally that night. But I know the truth. The ghost of that old house took her, and she'll never be seen again. This one time, me and my friend John were staying up late at my house, watching one of our favorite Let's Players called Karst Attempts on YouTube. He was playing one of the old Star Wars Dark Forces games, and we were just having fun talking with each other and zoning out while watching it. The night was going great until John suggested we try something a little different. He pulled out an old board game he had found in his attic called The Ritual. The game was supposed to be a way to contact spirits, and John thought it would be fun to try it out during our sleepover. I was hesitant at first, but John convinced me that it was just a game and nothing bad could happen. We set up the game in my living room, lighting candles and turning off the lights for a more eerie atmosphere. As we started playing, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. The game was simple enough. We had to roll the dice and move our pieces around the board, following the instructions on the cards we drew. But as we played, strange things started happening. The candles flickered and went out, even though there was no breeze in the room. The board started to shake, and the pieces moved on their own. John and I looked at each other, both feeling a sense of dread. We tried to stop playing, but the game wouldn't let us. It was as if some unseen force was controlling it, forcing us to continue. Then the lights in the room started to flicker on and off. We heard strange noises coming from the shadows, like whispers and laughter. John started to panic, saying we needed to stop playing immediately, but it was too late. The game had taken on a life of its own, and it wouldn't let us go. The last thing I remember was the room going completely dark, and the sound of John screaming. When I woke up, I was alone in the living room. The candles were still lit, and the game was gone. John was also nowhere to be found. I never saw John again after that night. The police searched for him, but he was never found. I tried so hard to forget about that night, but the memory haunts me to this day. And needless to say, I never played that board game again. I still remember celebrating my 12th birthday in a bowling alley, and my parents had agreed that some of my friends could sleep over afterwards. Things had started off really well, including the thrill of the game, the laughter, and the joy of being surrounded by my friends. Little did I know that the night would take such a dark turn. To paint a picture, the sleepover was set up in our living room, with sleeping bags and pillows scattered across the floor. We had planned a movie marathon, with popcorn and soda, and the promise of staying up all night. The first movie was a classic horror, chosen by my best friend Emily. As the night wore on, the shadows seemed to grow longer, and the air grew colder. As the movie ended, the lights flickered, and then went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the eerie glow of the television screen. We laughed nervously, thinking it was just a power outage, but then we heard it. A soft, whispering voice coming from the corner of the room. "Happy birthday," it said. Its voice was like a cold wind. We huddled together, our hearts pounding in our chests. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere all at once. It spoke again. "Make a wish, but be careful what you wish for." This is where panic started to set in. We tried to call for help, but our phones were all dead, and the landline was down. We were trapped, alone in the dark with whatever was out there. The voice continued to taunt us, telling us of our deepest fears, of the things that lurked in the shadows. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute more terrifying than the last. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the voice fell silent. We sat in stunned silence, too afraid to move or speak. The power eventually came back on, and the light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. We looked around, but there was nothing there. No sign of the voice, no trace of what had happened, no nothing. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder of the unknown. It was also a chilling reminder of the darkness that lies within. For my birthdays, my dad would usually let me have sleepovers, and he'd also take me and the other guests to this one miniature golf course. It was a tradition we had, and it never failed to bring a smile to my face. This year, it was no different. I'd invited 3 of my closest friends, and we were all excited for the fun that awaited us. Finally, the day of the sleepover came, and everything was going as planned. We played at the miniature golf course, laughing and joking around as we tried to get the lowest score. but as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake off this eerie feeling that something was off. It was as if someone was watching us, following our every move. That night, as we settled into our sleeping bags in the living room, the feeling only intensified. The lights flickered, and a cold wind blew through the house, even though all the windows were shut tight. My friends didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. As the night progressed, I started to hear whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, but as the hours passed, they grew louder and more distinct. I could make out words now, words that sent chills down my spine. "Let us in," the voices whispered. "Let us in." At first I tried to ignore them and tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew more insistent and more desperate. "Let us in," they screamed. "Let us in." I couldn't take it anymore. I woke my friends and told them what was happening. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They heard it too. We huddled together in the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the whispers only grew louder and more desperate. "Let us in," they screamed. "Let us in." And then the front door burst open. A gust of wind blew through the house, and with it came a darkness so thick, so palpable, it felt like it was choking us. We ran as fast as we could, out of the house and into the night, but the darkness followed us, and the whispers never stopped. "Let us in," they whispered. "Let us in." Ultimately, we never found out what they wanted or who they were. But one thing was for sure, we were never going to forget that night, and we were never going to have another sleepover again. My family lived in this neighborhood with a lot of hiking trails nearby, so during sleepovers, me and whoever was spending the night would usually play hide and seek on the trails while one of my parents watched us. It was a fun way to start the evening, and the thrill of the game in the dark woods made it even more exciting. One night, my best friend Lily was staying over. We decided to play hide and seek on the trails like we always did, but somehow this time it felt different. The air was heavy with humidity, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the forest seem even darker than usual. I was it first, and I counted to 100 while Lily ran off to hide. When I opened my eyes, the forest seemed to have swallowed her whole. I called out her name, but there was no response. I started to get a little nervous, but I pushed the feeling aside and began to search for her. As I walked deeper into the woods, the silence was deafening. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I called out for Lily again, but still there was no answer. And that's when I heard it, a soft, eerie laughter coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The laughter grew louder, and I could feel the presence of someone, or something, watching me. I started to run, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get away from whatever was in the woods with me. Suddenly I tripped over a tree root and fell to the ground. I could hear footsteps approaching, and I scrambled to my feet, ready to run again. But then a hand grabbed my shoulder, and I screamed. "Hey, it's just me," Lily said, laughing. "You should have seen your face." I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through me. "You scared me half to death," I said. We made our way back to the trailhead, where my mom was waiting for us. She looked relieved to see us, and we told her about our game and the creepy laughter we'd heard. "That's just the wind," she said, brushing it off. "The forest can play tricks on you at night." But as we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, watching us. And I knew that I would never forget the night I played hide and seek in the woods. Did you ever have that one friend that you could never tell exactly what they were thinking? You know, the kind of person who always seemed to be holding something back, keeping secrets just below the surface? That was Sarah. We had been friends since middle school, but it wasn't until our senior year of high school that we decided to have a sleepover at her house. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, so we had the place to ourselves. The night started off innocently enough. We ordered pizza, watched some cheesy horror movies, and talked about boys and college plans. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah was acting strange, even for her. It started with little things. She would look at me with a strange expression on her face, like she was trying to figure something out. Then she would look away quickly, as if she didn't want me to see what was going on in her head. As we got ready for bed, she started talking about her dreams. She said they were always the same. She was being chased by something, but she could never see what it was. She would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. That took me pretty off guard, and I honestly had no idea how to respond. I tried to comfort her, telling her it was just a dream. But Sarah just shook her head. I noticed that her eyes were wide and fearful. "No," she whispered, "it's not just a dream. It's real." The rest of the night was a blur. I remember trying to sleep, but the room felt charged with this energy I couldn't explain. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside, made my heart race. In the morning, Sarah was gone. I searched the house, calling her name, but there was no answer. I found a note on the kitchen table, written in her familiar, looping handwriting. "I'm sorry," it said. "I couldn't tell you. I thought it would be better if you didn't know." I never saw Sarah again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind is howling and the shadows are long, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there. I wonder if she's still running from the thing that chased her in her dreams. Just for the record, Halloween night sleepovers are the absolute best. I always look forward to the spooky season, and this year was no exception. My best friend Emily had invited me over for a sleepover on Halloween night. We had planned everything down to the last detail, from our matching witch costumes to the scary movies we'd watch. As the sun set, casting eerie shadows across the neighborhood, Emily and I set up our sleeping bags in her living room. We had the whole house to ourselves, as her parents were out of town for the weekend. The excitement was palpable as we prepared for a night of chills and thrills. We started things off with a classic, The Nightmare on Elm Street. As the movie played, we munched on popcorn and candy, screaming at the jump scares and laughing at the cheesy effects. It was the perfect start to our sleepover. After the movie, we decided to play a game of Ouija. We lit candles and placed our fingers on the planchette, giggling nervously as we asked the spirits to communicate with us. The planchette moved slowly at first, spelling out nonsensical words, but then it started to pick up speed, spelling out a message that sent chills down my spine. Get out. Emily and I exchanged a look, the fear in our eyes mirroring each other's. We quickly blew out the candles and turned on the lights, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over us. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The TV turned on by itself, flipping through channels before settling on static. The temperature in the room dropped, and we could see our breath in the air. And then, the most terrifying thing of all, a disembodied voice whispered, "You should have listened." We huddled together in our sleeping bags, too scared to move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and it filled us with dread. We knew we had to get out of there, but we were too paralyzed with fear to move. The voice continued to taunt us, telling us we were going to die. We could hear the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs, but when we looked, there was no one there. The fear was overwhelming, and we knew we had to make a run for it. We grabbed our things and sprinted out of the house, not stopping until we were safely inside my house, several blocks away. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory still haunts me to this day. Just for the record, Halloween night sleepovers are not the absolute best. They can also be the stuff of nightmares. One random day back in middle school, I started up this conversation with a kid I usually didn't talk to. His name was Ethan. He had a reputation for being a bit strange. But on this day, I was feeling adventurous for some reason and decided to see what he was all about. One thing led to another, and eventually Ethan invited me to a sleepover at his house that weekend. I was hesitant at first, but curiosity got the better of me. Eventually I accepted the invitation. The night of the sleepover, I arrived at Ethan's house, and everything seemed normal at first. We played video games, ate junk food, and talked about our favorite movies. But as the night went on, things started to take a creepy turn. Ethan told me a story about a ghost that haunted his house. He said that the ghost only appeared to people who were alone in a room. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a silly story. But as the night got later and Ethan went to sleep, I started to feel uneasy. For reference, I was alone in the guest bedroom, trying to fall asleep. Then I heard a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the tapping got louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Finally I got up to investigate, and that's when I saw it. a ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a woman with long tangled hair and a vacant expression. I froze, unable to move or scream. The ghost started to move towards me, and that's when I finally found my voice. I screamed and ran out of that room, waking up everyone in the house. Ethan came running to see what was going on, and when he saw the terrified look on my face, he knew. "I told you the ghost only appears to people who are alone," he said, with a mischievous grin. "You should have listened." From that night on, I never doubted Ethan's stories again, and I also never went to another sleepover at his house.